They say blood is thicker than water, a comforting phrase whispered at family gatherings. But the saying conveniently omits a darker truth. It fails to mention that the deepest cuts, the ones that never truly heal, are often inflicted by the knives kept inside the house. Trust, you see, is not like a bone that can be set and made stronger. It is like glass. Once shattered, you can try to piece it back together, but the cracks will always remain, and its reflection will never be the same. For Ethan, this chilling realization did not arrive with a thunderous crash or a shouted confession. It came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, delivered in a stiff, cream-colored envelope. He stood before Blackwood Manor, the sprawling stone house his father had designed and built, a monument to a lifetime of dedication. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a fragrance that had always meant homecoming and warmth. But today, it felt like the scent of decay was coming from within the house itself. His hand, the hand of an architect accustomed to steady precision, trembled slightly as he held the letter. It was an official notice, cold and clinical, filled with legal terms that swam before his eyes. But the message was brutally simple. He was being evicted from his own home. A wave of dizzying confusion washed over him. This was impossible, a mistake, a cruel, elaborate prank. He scanned the document again, his mind refusing to process the words, until his eyes landed on the name of the petitioner, the new legal owner of the property, Leo, his stepbrother, the man who had stood beside him at his father's grave, an arm slung around his shoulder in a show of solidarity, the man who had insisted on handling the mountain of paperwork, the tedious legalities of the estate, just so Ethan could have space to grieve. Attached to the notice was a copy of the deed of transfer, and there, at the bottom of the page, was the final, damning piece of evidence. His own signature. It was his, yet it wasn't. The familiar loops and strokes were there, a near-perfect imitation, but it felt like a ghost, a hollow echo of his own hand. In that single, heart-stopping moment, the fog of disbelief evaporated, replaced by the icy, horrifying clarity of betrayal. He looked up at the grand oak door, the windows that had held the warm glow of his childhood, and saw not a home, but a tomb. A tomb for his memories, for his naivety, for the brother he thought he had. He had not just been robbed of his inheritance. He had been erased from his own life by the one person he thought he could trust without question. And deep within the hollow space where his grief had resided, a new feeling began to smolder. It was not loud or explosive, but a cold, quiet rage, as patient and as meticulous as the foundations of the very house he was about to lose. To understand the depth of the deception, you must first understand the foundation upon which it was built. A foundation of seemingly unshakable love and absolute trust. Life before the fall was, for Ethan, a well-designed structure. He was an architect by trade and by nature, a man who believed in clean lines, solid footings, and the honest integrity of materials. His world was one of blueprints and calculated stresses where every element had a purpose and every angle was true. He had inherited this passion from his father, Richard Sterling, a titan in the construction industry, a man who could see a skyscraper in a block of empty air and whose handshake was as binding as any contract. Richard had built Sterling & Son Construction from the ground up, and he was grooming Ethan to one day take his place, not just as an heir, but as a true successor. Their bond was more than just father and son. It was one of mutual respect, a shared language of steel, glass, and ambition. Ethan didn't just love his father, he revered him. And in this carefully constructed life, Leo was a vital, load-bearing pillar. Or so Ethan believed. Leo was the son of Richard's second wife, Clara, a charming and fiercely protective mother who had entered their lives after Ethan's own mother had passed away years ago. Leo was everything Ethan was not. Where Ethan was quiet and methodical, Leo was effervescent and charming, a natural salesman who handled the client-facing side of the business. He could sell ice in a blizzard and make the customer feel grateful for the opportunity. On the surface, they were the perfect team, the artist and the showman, the architect and the dealmaker. Ethan had never felt a moment of rivalry with his stepbrother. He saw Leo's social grace not as a threat, but as a complementary skill. He truly loved him as a brother, blind to the subtle shadows that flickered in Leo's eyes whenever Richard would praise one of Ethan's designs. He missed the faint, bitter curl of Leo's lip when an old business associate would refer to Ethan as the real heir, and he was deaf to the whispers of Clara, who would console her son in private with placating words like, "Patience, my love. A salesman builds the empire, even if the architect gets his name on the building." She nurtured his resentment like a rare, poisonous orchid, watering it with sympathy and veiled promises. The final piece of this perfect facade was Sarah, Ethan's fiancée. She was brilliant, beautiful, and seemed to understand him in a way no one else ever had. She would listen for hours as he spoke of building codes and aesthetic principles, her eyes alight with what he mistook for genuine fascination. She championed his dreams, soothed his anxieties, and was his staunchest defender within the family. When Clara would make a backhanded comment about Ethan's obsessive work habits, Sarah would be the first to reframe it as dedication. She was the picture of unwavering support, the woman with whom he planned to fill the grand halls of Blackwood Manor with children and laughter. Theirs was a love story that their friends envied, a partnership that seemed as solid and well-planned as one of Ethan's own buildings. The three of them, Ethan, Leo, and Sarah, were a tight-knit unit, an impenetrable fortress of family and love against the outside world. Then, Richard died. It was sudden, a massive heart attack that stole him from them without warning. The Titan fell, and the entire structure of their world groaned under the sudden, immense strain. The grief that descended upon Blackwood Manor was a thick, suffocating fog. For Ethan, it was cataclysmic. He had not just lost his father, he had lost his mentor, his hero, his North Star. The blueprints on his desk seemed meaningless. The future, a terrifying, empty space. In the chaotic days that followed, consumed by a sorrow so profound it was a physical weight, Ethan retreated into himself. And into that void, Leo stepped, not as a brother in mourning, but as a savior. He was magnificent in his performance, a pillar of strength in the family's darkest hour. He handled the funeral arrangements, greeted the endless stream of mourners, and shielded Ethan from the worst of the administrative burdens. His every word was laced with concern, his every touch a gesture of comfort. Clara hovered in the background, her face a mask of sorrow, quietly praising her son's fortitude to anyone who would listen. And Sarah, she was Ethan's shadow, his rock, constantly at his side, holding his hand, whispering that it would all be okay, that Leo was a blessing, that they would get through this together. It was the perfect stage set for the perfect crime. The victim was blinded by grief. The villain was disguised as a hero, and the most trusted confidant was, in fact, the chief conspirator. The foundation of lies had been laid long ago, hidden beneath years of shared laughter, holiday dinners, and false promises. Richard's death had merely been the catalyst, the event that allowed the rot, so long festering in the dark, to finally begin its destructive work. The days that followed the funeral were a colorless blur. The great halls of Blackwood Manor, usually filled with the commanding presence of Richard Sterling, were now cavernously silent, the air thick with the cloying, sweet scent of wilting lilies. Ethan moved through the house like a ghost, untethered, his grief, a physical anchor dragging him down. He would find himself in his father's study, surrounded by the familiar scent of old books and leather, expecting Richard to look up from his desk and offer a piece of wisdom, only to be crushed anew by the echoing emptiness. It was in this state of profound vulnerability, adrift in a fog of sorrow, that Leo began his masterpiece of manipulation. He approached Ethan not with demands, but with a performance of such deep, compassionate empathy it was worthy of an award. He found Ethan sitting in Richard's armchair, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at a framed photograph of him and his father on a construction site years ago. Leo didn't speak at first, simply placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I know," he said, his voice a soft, sympathetic murmur. "I can't imagine what you're going through. He was your hero." He let the words hang in the air, a perfect acknowledgement of Ethan's unique pain. "Listen to me," Leo continued, pulling up a small chair. "The lawyers have been calling. The board needs direction. There are documents, probate filings, shareholder resolutions. It's a mountain, Ethan. And it's the last thing you should be carrying right now. Dad would want you to heal. Let me do this. Let me be the strong one for a while. It's my job as your brother to take the weight." Ethan looked at Leo, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, and felt a surge of overwhelming gratitude. In his fractured state, Leo's offer was a lifeline. He saw not a predator, but a protector. He nodded, unable to form the words to thank him. That was all the permission Leo needed. A few days later, he returned to the study carrying a thick, intimidating, leather-bound binder. He placed it on the desk with a soft thud. "It's all here," he said with a sigh, feigning reluctance. "I've organized everything to make it as painless as possible. Most of it is just formalities, things we have to sign to keep the company running smoothly during the transition." He opened the binder and began flipping through the pages, his actions creating a false sense of transparency. He would point to a tab. "This section is just authorizing me to be the temporary point of contact for the corporate attorneys. Standard stuff." He'd flip a few more pages. "These are the preliminary tax forms for the estate. A real headache, but they have to be filed." He explained a few mundane legitimate documents in excruciating detail, lulling Ethan into a state of passive compliance. His voice was a steady, calming drone, the words washing over Ethan without registering. Deep within the middle of the stack, nestled between a routine vendor contract renewal and a corporate banking resolution, was the document. It was a comprehensive transfer of assets, a legally binding instrument that irrevocably signed over Ethan's controlling shares in Sterling and Son Construction, his inheritance trust, and the deed to Blackwood Manor, all to Leo. When they reached that page, Leo didn't slow down. He gestured at it dismissively. "And this is the big one, the master directive for the estate trust. It basically gives me full administrative power to manage the assets until we get everything permanently settled. It's what allows me to handle everything else we just talked about. Keeps your signature off 1,000 smaller things." Just then, Sarah entered, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of tea. She smiled softly at Ethan, a picture of angelic concern. "How are you holding up?" she whispered, placing the tea beside him. She glanced at the binder. "Oh, the dreaded paperwork." She looked at Leo with admiring eyes. "You're a saint for taking all this on, Leo." She turned her attention back to Ethan, placing her hands on his shoulders, gently massaging the tense muscles. "Darling, I know this is awful, but Leo's right. Just sign what you need to, and then you can rest. We can put all of this ugliness behind us." Her touch was soothing, her voice a siren song of reassurance. She was his fiancée, his future wife. Her endorsement was the final, absolute guarantee of trust. Ethan picked up the pen she offered. His hand felt heavy, disconnected from his body. He looked down at the page Leo had indicated. The dense block of legal text was meaningless, a foreign language. He saw only his brother's reassuring face and his fiancée's loving smile. He signed his name, his usually firm signature wavering slightly. He signed away his company. He signed away his home. He signed away his future. As the pen lifted from the paper, a sense of relief washed over him, the false relief of a man who thinks he has just unburdened himself. Leo closed the binder with a quiet, satisfied snap. "There," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "It's done. The worst is over." He even managed to produce a tear, wiping it away with the back of his hand as he pulled Ethan into a hug. "I'll take care of everything now, brother, I promise." Sarah leaned in and kissed Ethan's forehead. "Now you can finally rest," she said. They left him there, alone in the quiet study, with his cup of tea and his devastating gratitude. He was a king who had just willingly handed over his crown, his kingdom, and his sword, thanking the usurpers for their kindness. The first few months after Richard's death were a long, slow climb out of a deep abyss. The raw, searing pain of loss gradually subsided, leaving a permanent hollow ache in its place. To fill that void, Ethan did the only thing he knew how. He worked. He threw himself back into his architecture, finding a fragile solace in the familiar logic of blueprints and design. His focus became a passion project he and his father had often discussed: an innovative, eco-friendly public library for the city's underprivileged downtown area. It was more than just a building. It was a tribute, a way to channel his father's philanthropic spirit into something tangible and lasting. For weeks, he worked tirelessly, pouring his grief and his talent into every line and every calculation. It was the first time since the funeral that he felt a flicker of his old self, a sense of purpose returning. He booked a meeting with the Sterling and Son board of directors, the same men who had bounced him on their knees at company picnics to present the proposal. He walked into the boardroom, the same room where his father had reigned for 40 years, feeling a nervous optimism. But the atmosphere was wrong. It was colder, more formal. Leo sat at the head of the table, in Richard's high-backed leather chair, looking perfectly at ease. Ethan began his presentation, his voice filled with passion as he laid out the vision. When he finished, he looked around the table, expecting discussion, perhaps even excitement. Instead, he was met with averted eyes and an uncomfortable silence. The chief financial officer, a man who had been Richard's right hand for decades, cleared his throat and spoke, not to Ethan, but to Leo. "While the design is admirable," he said stiffly, "the board feels that a pro bono project of this scale is fiscally irresponsible at this time. We are moving in a new, more aggressive strategic direction." The rejection was cold, clinical, and delivered with the finality of a slammed door. Stunned and confused, Ethan left the meeting feeling a profound sense of dislocation. Back in his office, he tried to access the company's financial projections to understand this new strategic direction. Access denied. He tried to log into the long-term investment portfolios his father had meticulously curated. Access denied. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He called the CFO's direct line, but was intercepted by a new, unfamiliar secretary who informed him in a coolly polite tone that all inquiries regarding company finances were now to be directed through Mr. Leo Sterling's office. He was being shut out. Systematically, quietly, the walls were being erected around him, isolating him within the very empire he was meant to inherit. A week later, he received a call from Margaret, the company's former chief accountant. She had retired a year prior but had remained a close friend of the family, a woman of fierce loyalty and impeccable integrity. Her voice, usually warm and cheerful, was strained with worry. "Ethan, I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been hearing things from my old colleagues, things that don't sit right with me." She hesitated. "Leo has liquidated 2 of the low-risk municipal bond funds your father called his rainy day accounts. The money is being funneled into a high-risk resort development in Belize. Your father looked at that same deal twice and called it a beautiful hole to pour money into." She took a breath. "He's also forced out Tom Landry from logistics and a few other senior people, all Richard's loyalists. He's replacing them with his own people. Ethan, this isn't how your father did business. This is reckless. Something is wrong." Ethan listened, but his mind was already building defenses. The idea that Leo, his brother, would intentionally do anything to harm the company was still unthinkable. It had to be a misunderstanding. "Margaret, I appreciate the call, I really do," he said, his tone more dismissive than he intended. "But Leo is just trying to make his own mark. Dad was a conservative businessman. Maybe Leo sees an opportunity, a chance to modernize. It's his company to run now, too. I'm sure he knows what he's doing." He heard the disappointment in her silence on the other end of the line. After a polite but firm goodbye, he hung up, a flicker of irritation, aimed not at Leo, but at Margaret for planting this seed of doubt, for disturbing the fragile peace he was trying to build. He chose to believe in the brother he loved, not the stranger Margaret was describing. That evening, he returned to Blackwood Manor, the unease from the day clinging to him like a damp coat. The house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. He mindlessly sorted through the day's mail as he walked through the foyer. Bills, magazines, junk mail. And then he saw it. A crisp, cream-colored envelope from a prestigious downtown law firm he had never heard of. He slid it open with his thumb, his mind still preoccupied with Margaret's warning. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes scanned the first few lines, the legal jargon blurring together, until a few key phrases leaped out at him. "Notice to vacate. Pursuant to the transfer of ownership, new legal proprietor, Mr. Leo Sterling. The paper fell from his trembling hand. It was an eviction notice. Suddenly, it all made sense. The cold boardroom, the locked accounts, Margaret's frantic warning. It wasn't a new business strategy. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a methodical, calculated conquest. He hadn't just been sidelined at work. He had been dispossessed entirely. And the final, brutal blow was that the order to throw him out of his father's house, his childhood home, came from his own brother. The first crack had just splintered into 1,000 pieces, and the world he knew had just ceased to exist. With the eviction notice clenched in his fist, the paper crinkled into a desperate ball, Ethan drove. He didn't know where he was going at first, his mind a chaotic storm of denial and white-hot fury. Then, instinct took over, guiding him toward the one place where this nightmare could be confronted, the gleaming downtown skyscraper that housed the headquarters of Sterling and Son Construction. He drove through the city, the familiar streets now a hostile landscape, his father's architectural landmarks mocking him from every corner. He wasn't just driving to an office. He was driving toward the heart of the treachery, to the throne room his father had built, now occupied by a usurper. He bypassed the new receptionist who tried to stop him, his face a mask of cold fury that she dared not challenge, and went straight to the top floor, to the CEO's corner office. He threw the door open with such force that it slammed against the wall, and the scene before him stopped his heart. Leo wasn't hunched over a desk, cackling like a caricature of a villain. He was standing by the vast panoramic window, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand, looking out over the city as if he owned it. And standing beside him, her hand resting intimately on his arm, was Sarah. She wasn't a hostage. She wasn't a victim. She was a partner. For a moment, Ethan's mind couldn't process the image. It was a glitch in reality. He held up the crumpled letter, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Leo, explain this. Right now. Tell me this is some kind of sick, twisted mistake." Leo turned from the window, not with the panic of a man discovered, but with the slow, languid grace of a predator who has been waiting for his prey to walk into the trap. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. "A mistake?" he said, his voice smooth as silk. "No, Ethan, this isn't a mistake. This is a correction. It's the period at the end of a very long, very boring sentence." He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Dad built this company, it's true. But he was sentimental. He saw it as a legacy, an art project. He didn't see what I saw. An engine, a weapon. And he made the one sentimental mistake he couldn't afford. He thought his blood was his best asset." He gestured around the opulent office. "This chair, this company, it requires a killer, not a dreamer. And you, little brother, you've always been a dreamer." The confession was so blatant, so devoid of remorse, that Ethan could barely breathe. The years of shared laughter, of brotherly advice, of feigned support, it was all a lie. A long, patient con. His eyes darted to Sarah, his last anchor in this capsizing world, pleading with her. "Sarah, tell me he's lying. Tell me you didn't know about this." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. But she didn't move toward him. Instead, she took a small step back, closer to Leo, her expression shifting from one of feigned surprise to one of cold, detached pity. The warm, loving woman he was supposed to marry vanished, replaced by a stranger with eyes like polished stones. "He's not lying, Ethan," she said, her voice even and calm, a terrifying counterpoint to the chaos raging inside him. "And I'm not a fool. I'm a pragmatist. I invested my life in this family, and I chose the investment with the higher return. I chose the future, not the past. I chose a winner." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, but he still couldn't grasp their full, horrifying meaning. "Chose? A winner? What are you talking about? We were getting married. We had a life planned." A dry, humorless laugh escaped Leo's lips. He put his arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Oh, you poor, naive fool," he sneered. "She's not talking about the company. Were you really so busy drawing your pretty little buildings that you never noticed? Never wondered why she was working late with me so often? We've been together for over a year. That was it. That was the blow that shattered everything. The double betrayal. His brother and his fiancée. The two pillars of his life, revealed to be the very architects of its destruction. A slideshow of memories flashed through his mind, now hideously recontextualized. Sarah's late nights at the office, Leo's knowing smirks, their shared private jokes he was never privy to. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered, "I love you" from Sarah was now a poisoned dart. Every act of brotherly kindness from Leo was a calculated move on a chessboard he didn't even know he was playing on. He felt the air leave his lungs, the strength drain from his legs. The loss of the company, the house, the money. It was all secondary now. This was the true theft. They had stolen his past, murdered his present, and erased his future. He stood there, mute and broken, looking at the two people he had loved most in the world, now revealed as his executioners. Leo raised his glass in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes glittering with triumph. "Don't forget the eviction date, Ethan. And please, close the door on your way out." The fall was as swift as it was brutal. Ethan stumbled out of his father's office and into a world that no longer recognized him. He was a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. The eviction from Blackwood Manor was a quiet, humiliating affair. He didn't fight it. He packed a single suitcase with clothes, a few books, and a small, worn wooden box containing his father's old drafting tools. As he walked out the grand oak door for the last time, he didn't look back. He couldn't. To look back would be to see the triumphant faces of Leo and Sarah, who were likely already choosing new curtains for his bedroom window. He was officially terminated from Sterling and Son, his email account deactivated, his legacy erased with a few keystrokes. The joint accounts he shared with Sarah, the ones that held the savings for their future, were emptied, her final act of plunder. He found a small, one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city crisscrossed by highways and railways, a place of perpetual noise and transient shadows. The paint on the walls was peeling, a faucet in the kitchen maintained a steady, maddening drip, and the thin walls offered no privacy from the lives of the strangers surrounding him. The sheer contrast to the opulent silence of Blackwood Manor was a form of daily torture. Here, in this cramped, anonymous box, he fell apart. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waking, staring at the ceiling, and succumbing to the crushing weight of his memories. He drank. He drank to silence the echoes of Leo's taunts and Sarah's cold, pragmatic voice. He drank to forget the feeling of her hand in his, a touch he now understood as the careful handling of an asset, not the caress of a lover. Every memory was now poisoned. A romantic weekend in Paris was no longer a cherished memory, but a calculated performance. A heartfelt conversation with Leo was not brotherly bonding, but an intelligence-gathering mission. He was a fool, a blind, trusting, sentimental fool, and the shame of it was a heavier burden than the grief. His friends tried to call at first, but their calls became less frequent. He knew what was happening. Leo and Sarah were masters of narrative. They were undoubtedly painting him as an unstable, grieving son who had suffered a mental breakdown, who was making wild accusations out of paranoia. He was being isolated, cut from the herd, left to die alone. And for a time, he was ready to oblige them. He was drowning, and a part of him didn't even want to fight for air. The turning point came not as a bolt of lightning, but as a quiet, sickening lurch in the pit of his stomach. It was late, perhaps 3 a.m, and he had run out of whiskey. He stumbled into the small, grimy bathroom and caught his reflection in the cheap, clouded mirror. He didn't recognize the man staring back. The face was gaunt, the eyes bloodshot and hollow, the spark of life completely extinguished. This was not the son of Richard Sterling. This was a victim, a casualty, a footnote in Leo's success story. And in that moment of stark, unflinching self-assessment, something shifted. The sorrow, which had been a vast, suffocating ocean, began to recede. And on the barren shoreline it left behind, something else began to crystallize. It was cold, it was hard, it was anger. Not the hot, explosive rage of his initial confrontation, but a deep, glacial fury. A calm, calculated hatred that was far more dangerous. He looked at his reflection again, and for the first time in weeks, he saw not what he had lost, but what he still had. He had his mind. He was an architect. What does an architect do when a structure fails? He doesn't weep over the rubble. He performs a forensic analysis. He finds the stress points, the faulty materials, the flawed design. He learns why it collapsed. Then, he designs something new, something stronger, something that can withstand any storm. Leo and Sarah thought they had destroyed him. They had only demolished the flimsy, naive structure of his old life. They had cleared the site. He walked out of the bathroom and over to the single suitcase he had never fully unpacked. He opened it and bypassed the clothes, lifting out the old wooden box. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, were his father's drafting tools. The heavy steel compass, the perfectly balanced rulers, the precision pens. He picked up the compass, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. This was an instrument of creation, of order, of logic. Leo's weapons were charm, deceit, and brute force. Ethan's weapons were patience, precision, and an obsessive attention to detail. He would not fight Leo on his terms. He would create a new blueprint, a blueprint for justice. He went to the rickety table that served as his desk, swept aside the empty bottles, and laid down a clean, fresh sheet of paper. The victim was gone, burned away in the crucible of his own despair. In his place sat an architect, ready to design the perfect, inescapable trap. And he drew the first deliberate line. The first name on Ethan's meticulously drawn list was Margaret. Contacting her was the essential first step, and also the most difficult. It required him to swallow the bitter pill of his own pride and admit the full, humiliating scope of his foolishness. He rehearsed the call in his head a dozen times, the words of apology feeling clumsy and inadequate. When he finally dialed her number, his heart hammered against his ribs. Her voice, when she answered, was cautious, guarded. He didn't blame her. He took a deep breath, and the voice that came out was not the one he had practiced. It was quieter, steadier, stripped of all pretense. "Margaret," he said, "it's Ethan Sterling. You tried to warn me, and I was too blind and too arrogant to listen. You were right about everything. I'm calling today to apologize and to ask for your help." They met the next day at a quiet, forgotten diner halfway between his rundown neighborhood and her tidy suburban home. It was a neutral ground, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee, where no one would know their names. When Margaret walked in, she looked older than he remembered, the lines of worry on her face etched a little deeper. She studied him as he stood to greet her, her gaze sharp and analytical, searching for the broken boy she had spoken to weeks ago. She did not find him. In his place was a man who, though thinner and marked by exhaustion, had a new, cold fire in his eyes. He began before the coffee even arrived, offering a full, unvarnished apology. He explained the fog of his grief, his desperate need to believe in the goodness of his brother, and the profound shame he now felt for dismissing her wisdom. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, he slid his notebook across the table. "This isn't a plea for sympathy, Margaret. This is a business proposal. I am going to dismantle what Leo has built on a foundation of lies, and I am going to do it with precision and facts. I'm not looking for revenge. I'm looking for justice, for my father. But I can't do it alone. I know the architecture of buildings, but you know the architecture of the company's finances. You know where the weaknesses are, where the stress points are. You know where the bodies are buried." Margaret slowly opened the notebook. She saw not the ramblings of a madman, but neat, ordered lists, potential legal avenues, timelines, key personnel from the company, and a list of questions, dozens of them, about corporate law and accounting principles. She looked up from the notebook, her eyes finally softening with something other than pity. But she wasn't convinced yet. "This is a good start, Ethan. But a plan is just a plan. Leo has an army of the best corporate lawyers in the country. He has a board of directors that he controls. He has the narrative. He's the grieving son who stepped up, while you're the unstable one who couldn't handle the pressure. It's their word against yours. What do you actually have? It was the test, and Ethan knew it. Right now, he answered honestly, I have nothing but my name and my resolve. That's why you're the first person I called. Without hard evidence, I have no case. I'm hoping you can point me toward where that evidence might be. He had passed. A slow, determined smile spread across Margaret's face. It was the first genuine smile Ethan had seen in months. I'm in, she said simply. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And you have more than you think you do. You think I just sat back and watched that slick-haired little parasite charm your father while picking his pockets? Richard was a great man, but his one blind spot was family. He wanted to see the good in Leo. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, sleek, external hard drive. She placed it on the table between them. It made a solid, definitive sound. For the last 2 years, I kept what I called an insurance policy. Every time Leo submitted an inflated expense report, every time a consulting fee was paid to a shell corporation I'd never heard of, every time a decimal point looked out of place, I made a copy of the raw data. The official books were being cooked, slowly, carefully, even before your father died, but I have the original recipes. She tapped the hard drive with her fingernail. I have a complete shadow ledger, encrypted, documenting every discrepancy, every unauthorized transfer, every single dollar Leo funneled out of that company for his own personal use. I started it to protect your father. Now, it will be the weapon that restores his legacy. Ethan stared at the small device as if it were the Holy Grail. It was everything. It was proof. It was the foundation for his entire case. The hope that bloomed in his chest was so fierce it almost hurt. Margaret saw the look on his face and nodded. Now, she said, her voice all business, this is a powerful weapon, but it's useless in our hands. We need a general, a lawyer, not the old family firm there in Leo's pocket now. We need a shark, someone who isn't afraid of the blood in the water. They spent the rest of the afternoon in Ethan's apartment, which for the first time felt less like a prison and more like a war room. With Margaret's guidance, they searched online, poring over legal journals and high-profile case results. They bypassed the big, white-shoe law firms and looked for independent fighters. And then they found him, Julian Croft. His reputation was notorious. He was a brilliant, theatrical, and utterly ruthless trial lawyer who specialized in taking on corporate giants. He was known as a champion for the underdog, a man who loved nothing more than toppling an opponent who seemed invincible. His track record was a string of stunning, high-profile victories that others had deemed impossible. The next day, Ethan made the call. He secured an appointment for the end of the week. As he hung up, he looked at Margaret, the data from her shadow ledger glowing on his laptop screen, a complex web of deceit now ready to be untangled. They had their evidence, they had their target, and they were about to hire their shark. The war had begun. Julian Croft's office was not what Ethan had expected. It wasn't the mahogany-paneled fortress of an established legal titan. It was stark, modern, and ruthlessly organized, a minimalist space of glass and steel overlooking the city's chaotic symphony of traffic. Croft himself was much like his office, lean, sharp, and radiating an energy that was less about warmth and more about cutting efficiency. He didn't offer them coffee. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He gestured to 2 chairs and said, "You have 1 hour. Impress me." Ethan, guided by the plan he and Margaret had rehearsed, told his story. He laid out the facts calmly and chronologically, suppressing the raw emotion and focusing on the sequence of the betrayal. Croft listened with an unnerving stillness, his eyes betraying nothing. When Ethan finished, Croft leaned back in his chair, tapping a sleek pen against his desk. "A tragic story," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy, "and a terrible case. A forged signature is a notoriously difficult thing to prove. He'll hire a handwriting expert, you'll hire one, and they'll cancel each other out. He will paint you as an emotionally distraught son, confused by grief, who signed something he now regrets. In court, it becomes your word against his and your ex-fiancée's. You'll lose. The cold assessment hung in the air, a deliberate splash of icy water. This was another test. Margaret, unflustered, placed her hard drive on the polished desk. "Our case isn't just about the signature," she said, her voice firm. "It's about a pattern of systematic fraud that began long before Richard Sterling's death." She slid a tablet toward Croft, displaying the neatly organized entry points to her shadow ledger. "This is a record of every unauthorized transfer, every ghost invoice, every dollar Leo siphoned into shell companies for the last 2 years." The forgery wasn't the beginning of the crime. It was the culmination. Croft picked up the tablet. For several long minutes, the only sound in the office was the soft flick of his thumb as he scrolled through the data. A flicker of something not sympathy but professional hunger appeared in his eyes. He looked up, a sharp, predatory gleam now present. "The signature is the story that will sell to a jury," he mused, "but this is the evidence that will hang him. This ledger gives us leverage. It gives us a narrative of intent." He stood up, a sudden, decisive movement. "I'll take the case. But let's be clear, this will be a war. They will try to bury you in legal fees, character assassinations, and procedural delays. I will need your complete dedication. We will need more than this ledger. We need to find a crack in everything." The following months were a descent into a new kind of hell, but this time it was a hell with a purpose. Ethan's small apartment became a war room. The walls were covered in timelines, diagrams of corporate structures, and enlarged photographs of the forged signature next to genuine examples. The maddening drip of the faucet was drowned out by the constant hum of a printer and the clatter of keyboards. While Margaret, with her encyclopedic knowledge of the company's past, worked with Croft's forensic accountants to turn her ledger into an ironclad legal document, Ethan's mission was different. He was the architect, tasked with deconstructing the lie. He spent hundreds of hours staring at the forged signature, analyzing the pressure of the ink, the spacing of the letters, the hesitation in the curves. He was looking for the forger's tell, the tiny, unconscious mistake. To keep himself afloat and to contribute to the growing war chest for legal fees, he began taking on small, freelance architectural jobs. He designed a kitchen renovation for a family in the suburbs, drafted plans for a backyard deck. It was humbling work, a world away from the skyscrapers his father had built, but it kept his skills sharp and his mind focused. It was a quiet act of rebuilding his life, even as he was trying to reclaim his past. Meanwhile, Croft's private investigators were at work. Their primary target was the notary public, whose stamp and signature legitimized the forged deed. His name was Daniel Jenkins. The investigators discovered he was a young, newly commissioned notary who had been working out of a small shipping store. A week after the date on the deed, he had quit his job, paid off a substantial student loan in a single cash payment, and moved across the country. It was a textbook case of a payoff. Finding him became their top priority. Ethan's breakthrough came late one night, in the pale, lonely glow of his laptop screen. He had given up on the signature itself. It was too perfect, too technically proficient. He turned his architect's eye to the document as a whole, specifically the legal description of the Blackwood Manor property. It was a dense block of text filled with surveyor's jargon. He pulled up the digital files of his father's original property surveys, files he had backed up to a personal cloud drive years ago. He began comparing them, line by tedious line. And then he saw it. A single, tiny, beautiful mistake. The forged deed described the property as Lot 7B, as per the Wakefield County Survey of 1998. But Ethan knew, with the certainty of a man who had studied his father's work his entire life, that a year ago Richard had finalized a minor boundary adjustment with their neighbor. It was a small transfer of less than an acre to resolve an old fence line dispute. The property had been officially redesignated and recorded with the county as Lot 7C. The forger, likely working from an older, more easily obtained digital file of the deed, had missed this minute administrative update. It was the architectural equivalent of leaving a fingerprint at the crime scene. It was an objective, verifiable error that proved the document was a fabrication based on outdated information. His heart pounding, he picked up the phone and called Julian Croft. It was after 2 a.m., but he didn't care. "I found it," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "I found the flaw in the blueprint." In that moment, the entire case shifted. They were no longer just chasing a ghost. They had a weapon. They had the ledger detailing the motive, a trail leading to a bribed witness, and now, a fatal, unarguable error embedded in the very bedrock of the crime itself. The foundation of Leo's empire had a crack, and Ethan Sterling, the architect, now knew exactly where to strike. The first shot of the war was not fired in a courtroom, but on paper. Julian Croft, with a surgeon's precision, drafted and filed the lawsuit. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression, a document that landed on the polished desks of Leo's legal team with the force of a controlled detonation. It alleged breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, and most damningly, fraudulent conveyance of assets. Croft had intentionally seeded the complaint with strategically vague yet menacing phrases, referencing a comprehensive record of financial malfeasance and incontrovertible flaws within the contested documents, along with the planned deposition of a key material witness to the deed's execution. He didn't lay all their cards on the table, but he showed just enough to let the other side know they were holding a losing hand. The effect was immediate. Leo, insulated by his own arrogance and the reassurances of his expensive lawyers, flew into a rage. He saw it as a desperate, pathetic attempt by a broken man to cause trouble. But Sarah, always the pragmatist, saw the danger. She understood that a public court case, regardless of the outcome, was unpredictable. The mere mention of financial records and a witness was a threat to the pristine public image they had so carefully constructed. The risk of their dirty laundry being aired for the world to see was too great. It was she who convinced Leo that they needed to crush this rebellion before it could gain any ground. They needed to make it go away, quietly and permanently. The summons for the meeting came through their lawyers. Leo wanted to see him. Julian Croft advised Ethan over the phone, his voice sharp. "He's rattled. This is a power play. He's going to try and put you back in your box. He'll dangle a carrot and hold a stick. Your only job is to show him that you are neither hungry nor afraid. Let him talk. Let him reveal his fear." Leo had chosen the venue with deliberate intent. A private dining room at Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it felt like it existed on a different plane of reality, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city below. It was a stage designed to remind Ethan of the world he had lost. When Ethan arrived, dressed in a simple, dark suit that was clean but a far cry from the designer labels Leo favored, they were already there. Leo and Sarah, looking like a royal couple, perfectly composed and radiating wealth. They made him wait a few beats before acknowledging him. A small, calculated act of dominance. "Ethan," Leo began, gesturing to the empty chair, his voice oozing a false paternal warmth. "I'm glad you came. I was sorry to hear about your legal filing. Grief does strange things to people. It can make them confused, irrational. I get it." Sarah nodded sadly, her expression a perfect mask of disappointed sympathy. "We're worried about you, Ethan," she said softly. Ethan remained silent, his face as impassive as a block of granite. He simply met their gaze, letting the silence stretch. Thrown off by his lack of a reaction, Leo pressed on, getting to the point. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the table. "Look, I don't want a family matter to become a public spectacle. It would be a disservice to Dad's memory. So I'm prepared to be the bigger man here." He tapped the folder. "Inside, you'll find a settlement offer, $5 million, tax-free. A clean slate for you to start over, anywhere you want. All you have to do is drop this embarrassing lawsuit and sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. It's an act of charity, brother to brother. It's more than you deserve, but I'm a generous man." He leaned back, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He had laid his trap. He expected Ethan to be overwhelmed, perhaps to weep with gratitude, or to at least open the folder and marvel at the sum. Ethan did none of those things. He didn't even glance at the folder. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the ice water the waiter had poured for him, placed the glass down, and looked directly at Leo. His voice, when he finally spoke, was unnervingly calm. "You're right about one thing, Leo," he said, the words precise and cold. "This is about Dad's memory." He gently pushed the untouched folder back across the table. "And his memory isn't for sale. Not for 5 million, not for 50. He then shifted his gaze to Sarah, holding it for a beat before returning to Leo. "You've made a fundamental error in your design. You see me as the man I was 6 months ago. You look at me and you see a victim you can buy off. But that man is gone. You destroyed him. The man sitting here today doesn't want a settlement. I want restitution." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, yet gaining an intensity that made Leo instinctively shrink back. "I don't want a piece of my inheritance. I want all of it. I want the company, I want the house, and I want the satisfaction of watching you explain under oath how you paid off a notary named Daniel Jenkins. I want to see the look on the jury's faces when my expert witness points out that the property deed you forged uses a county survey number that was 2 years out of date." "Oh." The color drained from Leo's face. Sarah's mask of composure shattered, her eyes wide with genuine shock. He knew. He knew the notary's name. He knew about the flaw in the deed. This wasn't a wild guess. This was a targeted strike. The foundations of their perfect crime were crumbling before their eyes. Ethan stood up, placing his napkin neatly on the table. "So you keep your charity. I have a feeling you're going to need it for your own legal fees." He looked down at them, 2 stunned, panicked figures in their gilded cage. "Thank you for the water. I'll see you in court." And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the untouched folder, the panoramic view, and 2 terrified tyrants in his wake. The psychological war had just been won, not with a shout, but with a whisper. The courtroom was a world unto itself, a self-contained universe of polished wood, hushed tones, and the oppressive weight of the law. The air was thick with a tension that felt physically present, a silent hum of anticipation. On one side of the aisle sat Leo, flanked by a phalanx of at least 4 high-priced lawyers from the city's most prestigious corporate law firm. They whispered amongst themselves, exuding an aura of expensive, unshakable confidence. On the other side sat Ethan, with Julian Croft beside him. Their team was smaller, an agile raiding party against a fortified army. In the gallery, directly behind them, sat Margaret, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a stoic mask. The trial began with opening statements. Leo's lead counsel, a silver-haired man named Davies with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, rose to address the jury. His approach was one of patronizing sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone gentle, "this is not, as the plaintiff would have you believe, a case about corporate malfeasance or elaborate fraud. This is a family tragedy. It is a case about the devastating, disorienting power of grief." He gestured sadly toward Ethan. "You will hear about a young man, a good man, who was understandably shattered by the sudden loss of his beloved father. And in the depths of that sorrow, his perception of reality became clouded. He began to see shadows where there were none, to imagine conspiracies where there was only kindness. He then painted Leo as the hero of the story. You will hear how his older brother, my client, Mr. Leo Sterling, stepped into the breach, how he shouldered the immense burden of a multinational corporation to allow his younger brother the space to heal. This lawsuit, this string of wild, unsubstantiated accusations, is not a quest for justice. It is a cry for help, twisted by anger and jealousy into a malicious attempt to extort money from the very man who tried to save him." End quote. When Davies sat down, a wave of sympathetic murmuring rippled through the courtroom. He had crafted a simple, believable narrative. Then, it was Croft's turn. He stood, and in contrast to Davies' theatrical pacing, he simply walked to the center of the floor and made eye contact with each juror, one by one. His voice was quiet, forcing them to lean in. "Before Richard Sterling built skyscrapers," Croft began, "he taught his 7-year-old son, Ethan, how to build a simple wooden birdhouse. He taught him that the most important part of any structure is its foundation. and that the strongest foundations are built with honesty, integrity, and trust. He paused. Mr. Davies is correct about one thing. This case is about grief. But it is the story of a grief that was weaponized. It is the story of a son who, while mourning his father, had the very foundation of his life systematically dismantled by the two people he trusted most in the world. He held up a single finger. We will prove, with verifiable facts, that the central document in this case is a forgery. He held up a second. We will prove, with a mountain of financial data, a clear and deliberate pattern of theft. And a third. And we will prove that this was not an act of kindness, but a cold, calculated coup. He walked back to his table. All we ask is that you keep an open mind and help us restore the foundation of truth that has been so cruelly broken. Howard. As the proceedings began, the defense called their first and most important witness to the stand, Sarah. She made her entrance a piece of theater in itself, dressed in a conservative navy blue dress, her face pale, her eyes cast downward, a portrait of reluctant, sorrowful duty. She took the oath, her voice barely a whisper. Davies began his questioning gently, leading her through the story they had so carefully rehearsed. She spoke of her deep love for Ethan, of their beautiful plans for the future. Then, her voice began to crack as she described the change in him after Richard's death. He just disappeared into himself, she said, dabbing her eye with a handkerchief. He became paranoid. He'd lock himself in the study for days, and when he came out, he'd have these wild ideas that someone was trying to ruin the company. He accused his father's oldest friends of being spies for competitors. It was terrifying to watch. Davies then guided her to the day of the signing. And on the day he signed the administrative papers for the estate, what was his state of mind? Sarah looked at the jury, her eyes welling with tears. He was so lost, but he was so grateful to Leo. I was there. I heard him say it myself. He said, "Thank God for Leo. I couldn't do this without him." He knew what he was signing. He was handing over the responsibility because he knew he couldn't handle it. It was an act of relief for him. The final questions were the most devastating. "Miss Evans," Davies said softly, "why did your engagement to Mr. Sterling end?" Sarah broke down completely now, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "His accusations, they turned on me," she cried. "He said I was part of the conspiracy. He looked at me with such hatred. I didn't know who he was anymore." She took a shaky breath. Leo was my friend. He saw what I was going through. He listened. He was just there. And yes," she confessed, as if revealing a shameful secret, "in that terrible, lonely time, we found comfort in each other. I felt so guilty, but I was falling apart, and he was the only one holding me together. It was a masterful performance." The jury was completely captivated, their faces a mixture of pity for Sarah and growing disdain for Ethan. He sat motionless, his face an unreadable mask, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes judging him, hating him. He had to listen to the woman he had once planned to spend his life with, the woman who knew his deepest secrets, twist them into weapons, and methodically assassinate his character in front of the world. Croft placed a steadying hand on his forearm, a silent command to endure. Davies looked at the weeping Sarah, then at the jury, and finally at the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The words hung in the air, a death sentence for Ethan's credibility. The scales of justice had just swung, hard and heavy, in Leo's favor. "Mr. Croft, your witness." The judge's words cut through the charged atmosphere. Julian Croft rose, his movements deliberate. He didn't storm toward the witness stand, where Sarah was still basking in the glow of her performance. He approached calmly, a file in his hand, and offered her a thin, professional smile. "Miss Evans, a truly moving story. I just have a few points of clarification for the jury." His voice was disarmingly gentle. "You testified that on the evening of May 12th, you were at Blackwood Manor, consoling Ethan during what you described as a paranoid episode. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sarah said, her confidence unwavering. "He was very unwell." "I see," Croft continued, opening his file. "Because your credit card records, which we have subpoenaed, show that on the evening of May 12th, You purchased $200 worth of champagne and room service at the Street Regis Hotel. A hotel, I might add, where a suite was booked under Mr. Leo Sterling's corporate account for that same night. A difficult thing to do, I imagine, while also being at home, consoling your distraught fiancé. Sarah's face went rigid, the color drained from her cheeks. We went there afterwards, she stammered. Afterwards? Croft pressed, his voice a little sharper. Your testimony placed you at home with Ethan until after midnight. The hotel charge is from 9:15 p.m. Were you in two places at once, Miss Evans? The jury stirred. The first lie had been exposed, a small, clean crack in her perfect veneer of credibility. Croft didn't linger. He moved on, hitting her with a rapid-fire series of factual questions about dates, company expenditures she had signed off on, and meetings she claimed to have attended. Her answers became tangled, contradictory. Her rehearsed story fell apart under the weight of simple, verifiable facts. By the time Croft was finished with her, she was no longer a sympathetic victim, but a flustered, exposed liar. With the momentum shifted, Croft called his first witness. The plaintiff calls Mr. Daniel Jenkins to the stand. A pale, terrified young man was sworn in. He looked at Leo with pleading eyes, but Leo wouldn't meet his gaze. Croft was gentle with him, guiding him through his testimony. Mr. Jenkins, he asked, can you tell the court how you came to notarize this document? In a halting, nervous voice, Jenkins told the whole sordid story. He spoke of being approached by a man on Leo's behalf, of the offer of $50,000 in cash to pay off his crippling student loans. He confessed that he never met Ethan, never saw him sign the paper. He was just told to stamp it and ask no questions. When Croft asked him to identify the man who had paid him, Jenkins raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at Leo. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Next came Margaret. She walked to the stand with the quiet confidence of a woman who deals only in facts. She was the anchor of their case. When Croft asked her to explain her shadow ledger, she did so with absolute clarity. Using a large screen so the jury could see, she presented charts and flow graphs that were devastatingly simple. This, she said, pointing to a column of figures, is the money leaving Sterling and Son for a shell corporation in the Bahamas called Apex Global Solutions. And this, she continued, highlighting another column, is the same amount of money, minus a small service fee, arriving in a private, numbered account. An account which we have traced directly to Mr. Leo Sterling. She repeated this process, transaction by transaction, painting a damning, undeniable picture of years of methodical theft. Leo wasn't a savior. He was a parasite who had been bleeding the company dry. The final blows came from the experts. First, a renowned handwriting analyst used high-resolution imaging to show the jury the microscopic signs of the forgery, the unnatural consistency of the pressure, the slight tremor of a hand carefully tracing a pattern. He declared it, without a shadow of a doubt, a high-quality but definite fake. Then, in a stroke of courtroom theater, Croft called his final witness. The plaintiff calls Ethan Sterling to the stand as an expert on the architectural and legal history of the Blackwood Manor property. Ethan took the stand, no longer the plaintiff, but a calm, collected expert in his own field. He didn't speak of his pain or the betrayal. He spoke of facts. He presented the jury with two official county survey maps. This first map, from 1998, shows my family's property designated as Lot 7B, he explained, his voice clear and steady. This second map, from last year, shows the same property after a minor boundary adjustment. As you can see, it is now officially designated Lot 7C. This is a matter of public record. He then directed the jury's attention to the forged deed, projected on the screen. The document, Mr. Sterling claims I signed just a few months ago, uses the outdated Lot 7B designation. It is a factual impossibility. It is a building constructed on a faulty blueprint, and like any such structure, it must be condemned. The cumulative weight of the evidence was crushing. Daniel Jenkins' confession, Margaret's ironclad financials, and Ethan's irrefutable factual error. It was a perfect, inescapable trap built of logic and truth. Leo's face was a mess of sweat and panic. Sarah looked physically ill. Their expensive lawyers raised feeble objections that were swatted down one by the judge. Their entire defense had been annihilated. The jury was out for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman's face was grim. He stood and read the verdict in a clear voice that echoed through the silent room. On the count of fraudulent conveyance, we find for the plaintiff. On the count of unjust enrichment, we find for the plaintiff. It was a total victory. The judge looked down from his bench, his expression stern. This court hereby voids the transfer of all assets and restores them to the sole ownership of Mr. Ethan Sterling. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on the evidence and testimony presented in this trial, this court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation into fraud, perjury, and witness tampering. He struck his gavel, the sound like a gunshot signaling the end of the war. Ethan looked over at Leo, a man who had seemed like a god just months ago, now reduced to a common criminal, pale and trembling as his world collapsed around him. It was over. Justice, meticulously designed and flawlessly executed, had been served. Walking back into Blackwood Manor was not the triumphant homecoming Ethan had imagined. He had won. The legal system had affirmed his ownership. The company was his. And the specter of Leo and Sarah was relegated to the coming horror of a criminal trial. Yet, as he stood in the grand foyer, the silence of the house felt different. It was no longer the warm, comforting silence of home, but the empty, echoing silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. He had won the war, but the scars of the conflict were etched into his very soul. The house was the same, but he was a changed man. The boy who had trusted implicitly, who saw the world through a lens of inherent goodness, was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood the true weight of a signature, the true price of trust. A few days later, Julian Croft met him in the study, the very room where the betrayal had been sealed. The lawyer, his usual sharp demeanor softened by a quiet respect, handed him a small, sealed package. "Your father's executor gave this to me," Croft said. "Richard's instructions were explicit. It was only to be given to you upon the final and absolute resolution of any legal disputes concerning his estate. I believe that day is today." After a firm handshake, Croft left, and Ethan was alone with the final ghost of his father. With trembling hands, he opened the package. Inside was a heavy, old-fashioned letter on his father's personal stationery and a small, dark micro-cassette recorder. He unfolded the letter first, recognizing his father's strong, familiar handwriting. "My dearest Ethan," it began. "If you are reading this, it means a storm has passed and you are still standing. For the pain you have surely endured, I am deeply, truly sorry. But I need you to understand that I did not leave you to this fate out of blindness, but out of a father's most difficult and painful love. I saw the serpents in our garden, my son. I saw Leo's ambitions sour into a poisonous greed, and I saw that Sarah's affection was a currency she was investing in your inheritance, not your heart. My greatest fear was never that they would steal my company. It was that your own goodness, your unwavering trust, would leave you defenseless in this world long after I was gone. I could have simply cut them out, exposed them myself, but that would have been my victory, a final act of a dying king protecting his prince. It would not have been yours. To truly lead, to truly own your legacy, you had to learn to forge your own armor. I had to trust that the foundation I helped you build was strong enough for you to survive the fire. It was the greatest, most terrible gamble of my life, a wager of my entire legacy on the strength of your character. Reading this, I know that my faith in you was not misplaced." Tears blurred the words on the page. Ethan picked up the small recorder and pressed the play button. A faint hiss filled the room, and then a voice from the grave. His father's, and Leo's. The recording was from weeks before Richard's death. Leo's voice was smooth, persuasive, full of veiled suggestions. "And all I'm saying, Richard, is that Ethan is an artist. He doesn't have the killer instinct this company needs to grow in the next decade. Giving me operational control now would just be a smoother transition." There was a pause, And then his father's voice came, calm, firm, and absolute. The company is named Sterling and Son for a reason, Leo. You see Ethan's kindness as a liability. I see it as his greatest strength, but do not ever mistake that kindness for weakness. He is a builder, and a good builder knows his foundation better than anyone. When the time comes, he will know how to defend what is his. My faith is in my son. This discussion is over. End. The tape clicked off, but the words echoed in the profound silence of the room. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate validation. His father had known. He had believed in him. The brutal ordeal he had endured was not a random act of cruelty from the universe, but a final, terrible, and loving lesson from his father. It was a trial by fire, designed to forge the boy he had raised into the man he knew he needed to become. The tears that streamed down Ethan's face were no longer of grief or anger, but of a deep, aching, and profound understanding. He had not just won back his inheritance, he had earned it. He had proven his father right. He stood and looked out the window of his father's study at the sprawling grounds of his home. He was a king who had been forced to conquer his own kingdom. The victory was not sweet, but it was absolute. And in the quiet that followed the storm, he finally found a peace he had never known before, the peace of a man who had faced the very worst of human nature and had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For when they finally decide to speak, their voice will not be rain but thunder. Truth has been revealed, and justice, however delayed, has been served. But every family has its secrets, its own foundations built on truth or lies. Join us next time as we open another door.